Thank you for entertaining a discussion in blockchain from a former physicist. I may relapse at some stage, but at the moment, one of the interesting parts of life has been in crossing that barrier. And really in trying to bring what learnings we can from science and try to bring them into the world of business, and more specifically into the world of disruptive innovation. So if we look at these two graphs on the side, the top one is the average length of time that a business actually lasts from its inception and all the way through. You'll notice from the 1960s that businesses used to last between 50 to 60 years. And as we move forward, we're noticing that some businesses are now lasting probably between 12 and 15 years. So it's a trend that's begun to emerge. And the other thing, if you notice on the graph on the bottom, these both are graphs from InnoSight, that businesses now are getting to a valuation of $1 billion much quicker than they used to in the past. And so what this tells you really empirically is that businesses are coming to the point where they're growing much faster, but they're also collapsing much faster. And there's a point to be made there that at current churn rates, about 75% of the S&P 500 will not exist by 2027, in just 10 short years. And there's something that Steve Ballmer said on the introduction of the first iPhone. He said, this will never happen. This will not achieve market penetration. We see now that we simply cannot predict them. And this is a technical expert in the space. We're not able to predict what the future holds. And certainly we can't in business try to predict that either. And this is the typical corporate life cycle. So it starts at the bottom, it develops, it then launches, it goes through a stage of rapid growth, finally reaching maturity and declining. And there have been so many efforts, mostly by colleagues in the management consulting space and also in economic and management theory, that have tried to string this process out as much as possible. And in fact, one of them, just a show of hands, who knows about Porter and his 5 forces? Some people. I thought a little bit more. So Michael Porter's a professor at Harvard Business School, and he came up with the idea that sustained competitive advantage can be deduced from the market. That is, that there are some forces at play that if you can manipulate, you'll be able to extend that life cycle of your business for longer than it might be. We've shown already, though, that empirical evidence suggests that they might not be the case. And indeed, Porter's assumptions were based on these 3 key ideas: that buyers, competitors, and suppliers will not collude. Secondly, that the source of value is in structural advantage. So that is that the value that a business creates is actually in being able to solidify its position. And thirdly, that business certainty is high. That is, that it allows the markets to respond and plan for competitive behavior. What's really interesting is that Porter, taking these ideas, started a business in 1983, called it the Monitor Group. And it turns out that sometime later, the business actually collapsed and in fact sold all of its assets. And what I'll do is bring back the graph that we had earlier, but the actual graph from the S&P 500 index. And what I've done is looked at a company that would have been started in 1983 and looked at the statistical probability of a company, irrespective of what it did, and how long that should last. Michael Porter's company lasted for 29 years. The average on that graph is that a company started in 1983 should have lasted 27.5. So for the man who purported to know how to create a sustainable business, he was able to achieve 18 months over the statistical likelihood of a business succeeding. So that just really goes to show, you can't make this stuff up, by the way. This stuff comes straight out of the research in putting this talk together. But what it really tells you is that there is no conceivable way, other than government regulation, that you're able to create sustainable competitive advantage. One of the interesting insights when we're dealing with problems like this, we have complex problems, and often those complex problems come towards undirected outcomes. An example's an anecdote, whether it's true or not, I suppose it probably is, from the British colonial times in India. There was a big problem with cobras in Delhi. And one of the methods to try and solve this cobra problem was that people were offered, for every cobra skin that they would bring, that they would be offered some amount of money. And what you might expect is that this seems like a fairly logically rigorous way to indeed solve a problem. And so indeed they found that the graph looked something like this. The number of snakes actually fell as a proportion of time. But then something really, really interesting happened. This is what actually happened. Does anyone want to have a guess as to why? And if you don't know the answer, you're not allowed to say. Exactly. So they started to breed. So what we did was, whilst we had a compelling idea for a solution, what ended up happening is that the market responded by creating a solution of its own. And indeed, once they found this out, they said, well, we're putting a ban on all of these snakes. Keep them if you like. Of course, instantly, the monetary value of those snakes went down to zero. And what happened? The snakes were all released into the wild, exacerbating the very problem. There were more snakes at the end than there were at the beginning, and exacerbating the very problem that we were trying to solve in the first place. So hopefully with these two anecdotes together, the story of Monitor Group and the story of the snakes, you'll begin to understand that we try as much as we might to predict unpredictable things, and there is no possibility of doing that. When we look at creating innovations, what we assume, much like we did for the snakes, is that the more resources, the more time, the more energy, the more people, the more money that we spend, is that there's some sort of a linear correlation between the amount of innovation we'll get out. And in fact, the opposite is true. What you'll realize is that innovation returns do not conform to some linearity with the amount of resources we throw. Instead, there is sort of a maximum that's reached, and then afterwards, what we find is that the innovation actually tends, or the possibility or the outcomes of innovation, as we're measuring here, dollars for dollars, actually turn down. And it's really simple, and it's bounded in basic common sense, and that is that if we're trying to make money by spending money, there's going to be a point where if we spend too much, then we're sort of working ourselves into a difficult position. And indeed, Steve Jobs understood this from the work that he did, probably at one of the most innovative tech companies, understood this and said that innovation has nothing to do with how many R&D dollars you have, and indeed he identified it's about the people and the way that you think about things. And what I'm here to talk about today is the way that we can think about innovation in a very, very different way. There was talk mentioned about earlier about expanding this curve and about looking at the core ideas of what businesses bring, and then trying to expand these ideas out. And I think the approach, and this is an approach that was from one of the few good things that's come out of Harvard, and forgive me for anybody who's gone to Harvard, but there are some corrosive business ideas that have come out of there. But one of the good ones has been here in trying to understand that there are core parts of a business, and these are very important to try and solidify. And this is really part of the executive capabilities. Then there are things that we need to do that are adjacent to our business. So if I have a core foundation, there are things that we do along each side. And then finally, what we have to do, as the lady in the front mentioned, we talked about, about Emirates NBD in the issue of checks. And the question came from the side and said, well, what if we don't need checks at all? So the idea of putting a hash on a check is really trying to solidify our existing base. But then a question that emerges is, well, what happens if we don't need checks at all? And this is the type of idea that we want to understand. How much effort do we put into our core businesses? How much effort do we put into our adjacent businesses? And how much effort do we put into disrupting? And really it's about understanding the process and the methodology, and indeed what I'll talk about later, which is the culture of breeding these innovations. So there's a fundamental difference between startups and businesses that I found in my interactions with people that people just don't understand. And what I want to do here is clarify it. A startup is not a business. In fact, a startup is a scientific experiment, or the closest thing it can be to a scientific experiment. It's a temporary organization. This comes from Steve Blank, for those of you who know it. And it's a search for a sustainable, competitive business model. So what it starts with is not knowing something and getting to the point where they do know something. Now, the point is that the assets that or the resources rather, that we spend in trying to do that, we want to minimize. And I'll talk to you today, the thesis of this talk is about how we can do that as quickly and as cheaply and as informatively as possible. And then we understand that an established company really executes on a known business model that addresses the known market and understands their needs. So the point is that businesses do one thing and startups do something totally and completely different. So a startup is as far removed from a business as it is to a scientific experiment, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. Often the commonly held belief is that bigger is better. But there's a story, sort of an old biblical tale for 3,000 years from David and Goliath, and the story that David might have perhaps been lucky to have smote Goliath, or whatever the past tense of smite is. In fact, when we revisit that story and look a little bit deeper into the details, as Malcolm Gladwell did in the story of David and Goliath in his, one of his most recent books, what we come to understand is that David's size was in fact his competitive advantage. And so Goliath was a close quarters combat warrior, and had David fought at the same rules that Goliath did, what we'd find is that he would have been under quite a bit of trouble because he didn't have the same tools at his disposal. So if we compare David and Goliath, Goliath being a large business with all the resources and assets that a large business has at its disposal, and we look at David, a small, nimble competitor, what we notice is that the competitive advantage that David had in not being able to conform to the rules that Goliath was able to fight against was actually able to beat him. So as we take this idea further forward, if we look at examples here, this is one from NASA in comparison to SpaceX. NASA, it costs NASA about $1.5 billion to launch a satellite, to launch a rocket rather, into orbit. SpaceX, as a private business, was looking to see if he could disrupt this space. You don't have to know much about this, and I'll only go into this in a little bit of detail to illustrate the point, that the amount of money that it costs to launch a rocket is about 98 to 99% in the rocket and 1% in the fuel. So understanding that the levers and mechanisms were there, NASA never really had the insight, because they had so much money and so many resources at their disposal, to say, well, why don't we try reusing the rockets? So these rockets, as they go up, they sort of part and then they fall into the sea and they're not reused again. SpaceX, run by our friend Elon Musk, didn't have that opportunity. It was limited. Its business model was constrained. And so what it did instead was said, well, we can't jettison the rocket and not use it again. We have to reuse it. So they developed this incredible technology of being able to launch a rocket and then getting it to come back down and actually fall into place. A SpaceX launch costs $61 million, 1/25 of the value for ostensibly an equivalent result. With Blockbuster and Netflix in the entertainment space, Blockbuster was known for having a shop on every corner. And Netflix, of course, disrupted that model by saying we don't need shops to deliver the same service. The value proposition to customers was exactly the same. At its height, Blockbuster employed 60,000 people with a market cap of $5 billion. Netflix employs 3,500 people with a market cap of $41 billion. 1/25 of the staff, I think, and a significantly increased market cap. Kodak and Instagram, I think, is very well known. Kodak, as it folded, was basically came to a value of zero. But the idea here was that Instagram fundamentally reimagined what photo sharing was about. And so they said, we don't need film to share photos with one another, we'll do it on the internet. If we look at an example that's a little bit closer to home in the oil and gas space, what Statoil, Norway's largest producer of oil, in fact state-funded, reimagined what it meant to produce energy. So they thought about themselves not as an oil and gas provider, which would be inherent. I mean, the logo itself is a drop. But instead leveraged the technology that they had and reimagined their business and said, what we'll do is we'll take oil rig technology, so they have windmills at the moment, the High Wind project. They said, we will take the technology from oil rigs and we will repurpose that to produce wind power. And this is also one of the interesting things that happened out of that, was that they were able to solidify their existing base. They accessed and tapped and in fact created new revenue streams, and then continued on to generate entirely new asset structures and entirely new revenues out of something that wasn't. So what we come to then is this idea about smart failure. And smart failure is a methodology that's really part of evolutionary economics, or the latest thinking, and really an understanding that if you're trying to create scientific experiments in a startup and as corporate entities trying to work through, that you need to do three things. You need to fail very quickly, you need to fail very cheaply, you need to fail informatively. And indeed, as Elon Musk says, if you're not failing, you're not innovating. And the way that I'll describe this is through a game of battleships. And if we take these three core concepts and say that we're playing battleships against one another, if I say to you that every time I take one shot, you get to take two shots, so everybody knows broadly how battleships works, that means you get to explore this space, this unknown space, twice as quickly as I can. If they're cheaper, if you get twice the amount of pins, you'll be able to have twice the amount of goes. And indeed, if I said to you, every time you drop a pin, you get to see all of the pins around it, you'll be able to investigate that space a lot quicker. And so the idea here is to take exactly this approach and understand that as a business that has all of these resources available to it, they in fact have 1,000 ways to solve this problem. A startup does not have that same possibility. It has everything just as David had with respect to his fight with Goliath. They have constrained access to people, constrained assets, constrained resources. And so what they need to do is to go to the very market that's going to be buying or taking part in this product. They need to observe what the need is, and they enter this cycle. You'll notice that these cycles are cyclical, and it's not a waterfall plot. So it's not that it's stage-gated or a linear process. These are cyclical processes. So what we do is try to come up with a hypothesis and create an experiment. And out of that experiment, we then go into the second loop, which is to create MVPs. So create MVPs, get learnings from the market, and then go further forward. And then finally, we look at how do we grow these businesses. The second part, so that's the process. The second part's in the portfolio management. So what we do here is, for the first horizon, for solidifying our current business model, we spend 70% of our innovation budget. For the second part, for the adjacent businesses, we'll spend 20%. And then for the disruptive innovations, the ideas where perhaps checks won't be needed in the future, we put some amount of money into there as well. And the interesting thing is you'll notice that the amounts become smaller as we go further up. So we actually apportion our money depending on the risk, but also depending on the reward. And then if we compare the innovation culture compared to the corporate boardroom versus the scientific lab, what we notice is in the corporate world, we assume because we were successful once that we can do it again. In the scientific world, we say, well, this is so advanced that we can't possibly assume that we know anything. Industry best practices become falsifiable hypotheses or testable questions. And as you go through, if you'd like to take pictures, I can share it with you later. We have a whole way, our entire methodology about how we approach problems is fundamentally different to the way businesses do. And so that's what I'm looking to do. So very quickly, a couple of case studies. Some of the work that I've been doing is with the Sharjah Entrepreneurship Center, Shara. And in fact, one of the teams you can see joining me on the table. We had 10 teams, very green in terms of business experience, and we took them from 0 to 4 months, and we developed their ideas, worked with them to develop their ideas into concepts, into products that then moved out into the market. And what we did was applied startup-specific KPIs. None of them had to produce budgets. None of them were constrained by MVP or ARR or return on net assets or any of these things. But instead, we created specialized KPIs that were specific to startup metrics that we developed for this program. The second one, the same team actually went on to win the Google for Entrepreneurs FinTech Startup Hackathon. So congratulations to them on that. I thought I'd give them a shout out here. And in 54, cheers guys. And in 54 hours, they're able to develop, now I might get this right, it's Sharia compliant share trading globally. So in 54 hours, they were able to develop that solution. What I will note is at this event, it was held in Abu Dhabi at Glasscube, not a single bank actually showed up. Not a representative of a bank, not a CIO or anything else of a bank, nobody showed up from the banking sector, which also brings to our attention that this kind of stuff, the idea of perhaps we won't need checks in the future, isn't showing up generally in sort of in the hierarchy of the banks. And so finally, we're also bringing the smart failure approach to Expo 2020. We're working with them on a strategy to develop entrepreneurial competencies in young people, with the Emirates Youth Council and the 2017 strategy to develop Emirati entrepreneurship, and finally with the Ministry of Education to develop an entrepreneurship toolkit that's going to be used across the government sector agencies. And finally, something that will become much more public in the news very soon. We're working on a public-private partnership to develop healthcare incubation, which is being driven not by the government, but by the private sector. So that's something very exciting that we'll be talking about later. And with that, thank you very much for your time.